Genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. Thomas Edison. In 1921, a Stanford psychologist named Lewis Terman set out to find the architects of the 20th century. He tested more than 250,000 California schoolchildren, searching for the rarest minds in the state. From that vast pool, he selected 1,521 children with an IQ above 140 and gave them a name that would outlive him: the termites. He followed them for the rest of their natural lives in what became one of the longest-running studies in the history of psychology. Most of them grew up to be dentists, accountants, school teachers, mid-level managers. One became a typesetter. Not one of them ever won a Nobel Prize. 2 boys applied to join Terman's study and were turned away. Their scores fell just short of the cutoff, close, but not close enough. Their names were William Shockley and Luis Walter Alvarez. Both went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics. Shockley in 1956 for co-inventing the transistor, Alvarez in 1968 for his work on subatomic particles and the bubble chamber. The 2 boys, judged not quite brilliant enough to be studied, ended up reshaping physics. The 1,521 children, judged brilliant enough to be chosen, mostly became comfortable and unremarkable. That is not an anomaly buried in old data. That is a pattern. And it is exactly the pattern that most gifted adults spend their entire lives refusing to look at directly. The comforting lie. There is a story that intelligent people tell themselves, quietly, for decades. It goes like this. Smart people rise, and if they don't, the world simply failed to notice them in time. The genius was undiscovered. The genius was misunderstood. The genius was held back by a mediocre world that couldn't keep pace. It is a comforting story. It is also, for most of the people who tell it, a lie. The truth is colder. The genius was not held back by the world. The genius was held back by himself. Intelligence, the kind that gets praised in childhood, the kind that makes adults lower their voices and whisper, "gifted," as though naming a diagnosis, is not, by itself, a tool for building a life. In many cases, it behaves more like a sedative. It rewards the brain so heavily for recognizing what needs to be done that recognition becomes almost indistinguishable from doing it. You see the solution. You feel the relief. The chemical reward fires, and nothing in your actual life changes. The cognitive psychologist Scott Barry Kaufman, who has spent more than a decade studying gifted underachievement, put it with brutal precision. Cognition without execution is a prison built from your own ceiling. The smart person does not fail because the world is too slow to catch up with them. They fail because their intelligence keeps doing, inside their skull, the work that was supposed to happen with their hands. What follows are 5 traps. Not the obvious ones. Not the ones self-help books like to name. These are the traps that work precisely because the person caught inside them is too clever to notice the door closing. The recognition sedative. Picture a sharp mind sitting down with a new framework for change, a course on discipline, a book on habit design, a thread promising the one mental model that fixes everything. Within an hour, they can restate the whole argument better than the author did. They can already picture the reorganized week, the finished project, the version of themselves who follows through. Something in their chest settles, as if the matter were already handled. A season passes. The week looks exactly as it did before they ever opened the thing. Call it what it actually is, not idleness, not a failure of willpower, but a much stranger malfunction, the brain quietly logging comprehension as if it were completion. There is real neuroscience behind this. The neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz spent decades mapping how dopamine fires in the primate brain, and his central finding, replicated many times since the 1990s, is that dopamine does not reward you for getting what you want. It rewards you for the moment your brain predicts that you will get it. The chemical spike arrives on the upswing of recognition, not on the achievement itself. By the time the actual reward shows up, the chemistry has already gone quiet. A highly intelligent person lives, more often than they realize, almost permanently inside that upswing. They recognize instantly what their life needs: the path to fitness, to financial security, to mastery of a craft, to the relationship they actually want. Recognition arrives in seconds because their cognitive engine is fast. The dopamine fires. The internal sense of progress is satisfied, and the body never moves. This is why the most insightful person in almost any friend group is often the one whose life looks the most unchanged year after year. They are being paid again and again in counterfeit currency. The sensation of having something figured out sits so close to the sensation of having done it that their nervous system genuinely cannot tell the two apart. People with less raw processing speed rarely have this particular problem. For them, the reward only arrives once the work is finished, so they are forced to do the work to feel anything at all. The gifted mind, cruelly, is wired to feel the reward of accomplishment without first paying the price of accomplishing anything. Consider the bookshelf of half-finished self-improvement books that sits in so many intelligent households. Every one of them represented a small, complete transaction. Attention paid in, the feeling of being smart paid back out, settled in full before the work of applying any of it ever began. This is the first trap, and once it is named, it becomes almost impossible not to see everywhere, in your friends, in the people you envy, and, if you are being honest with yourself, in your own bookshelf. But the recognition sedative only works on a mind that already believes it is special. And that belief, the deep, unexamined certainty of being different, marked, gifted, is planted somewhere very specific and very early. The praise paradox. In 1998, a psychologist named Carol Dweck ran an experiment at Columbia University that, by any fair measure, should have reshaped how an entire generation of parents spoke to their children. It mostly didn't. Dweck gave a group of fifth graders a set of puzzles. Once they had finished, half the children were praised for being smart. You must be really intelligent. The other half were praised for their effort. You must have worked really hard. Then she offered every child a choice between a harder puzzle and an easier one. Given the choice, the group told they were smart kept reaching for the safer puzzle, again and again, session after session. The group told they had worked hard kept reaching for the harder one, unprompted. Dweck reran the study with different ages and different puzzles across the years that followed, and the split held every time. Praising a child for being smart does not produce a child who chases challenges. It produces a child who avoids them. The moment a child comes to believe they are smart, being smart turns into a status that must be defended rather than a capacity that can be spent. Every difficult problem becomes a referendum on identity. A hard task is no longer simply a task, it is a threat. Failing it does not mean the puzzle went unsolved. It means the child is not who they believe themselves to be. This is the praise paradox. The exact words meant to lift a gifted child are the words most likely to freeze them in place. By the time that child becomes a gifted adult, their entire sense of self is a load-bearing wall, and they can no longer afford to attempt anything that might bring it down. So they specialize. They retreat into domains where their intelligence is the dominant variable, and they quietly avoid every arena where it isn't. This is why so many high IQ adults end up confined to narrow lanes that have almost nothing to do with what they originally wanted from life. They wanted to write a novel. They became a corporate strategist. They wanted to build a company. They became the consultant who explains, from a safe distance, everything wrong with other people's companies. They wanted an interesting life. Instead, they built a fortified one, a life engineered to protect an identity from any test that might break it. The Hungarian-American mathematician Paul Halmos once observed that the difference between a great mathematician and merely a competent one is rarely intelligence. It is the willingness to feel stupid for hours at a stretch. The competent ones cannot tolerate that feeling, so they work only on problems they already know they can solve. The great ones sit inside genuine not knowing for days, weeks, sometimes months, and let it move through them without flinching. A mind still governed by the praise it received as a child cannot do this. Looking stupid threatens the wall. So the gifted adult builds a small, guaranteed kingdom of wins and calls it a life. And then, when that kingdom starts to feel too small to contain them, they reach for something so distant and so improbable that never attempting it requires no explanation at all, which is exactly the next trap. The asymmetric standard. The gifted underachiever tends to operate on two settings only: things they can already do perfectly and things that supposedly don't count. There is very little in between. A person with an ordinary relationship to effort sees a full continuum between trying and outcome. They attempt things they might turn out to be mediocre at. They take on tasks they might fail. They live, most of the time, in the wide, unglamorous middle range where the actual substance of a life gets built. The gifted adult avoids that middle almost instinctively because the middle is where performance becomes legible. In the middle, "I am smart" gets tested against a real, falsifiable result and either survives the test or doesn't. So the gifted mind splits toward the two extremes. On one side, it takes on tasks it has already mastered, or that sit comfortably beneath its true capability, and performs them reliably, collecting small, safe reinforcements. "You're so good at this." On the other side, it fantasizes about pursuits so vast that the absence of any real attempt requires no justification whatsoever. They will one day write the novel that redefines the form. They will start the company that reshapes an industry. They will produce the body of work that outlives them. Notice that these grand, distant ambitions are, by design, unfalsifiable. As long as they are never begun, they cannot fail. The dream survives untouched forever in the realm of pure potential, because the actual book, the actual business, the actual training program never gets built. Building it would require the gifted adult to be openly average for a long stretch of time before ever becoming good. And being visibly average is precisely what their protected identity cannot survive. The journalist and researcher David Epstein, in his book Range, describes something he calls the match quality problem. The longer a person delays testing themselves against real tasks they might fail at, the worse their judgment becomes about what they are actually suited for. Without that testing, career decisions end up shaped by prolonged fantasy instead of tested reality, and people frequently drift into fields they never genuinely tried themselves against, because trying was exactly the uncomfortable part they had spent years avoiding. There is a darker layer beneath this trap. The gifted adult often begins to feel a quiet, private superiority over the colleague who actually published the merely decent novel, launched the company that eventually failed, or finished the imperfect album. That colleague did the thing. That colleague now has a body of work the world is free to judge and criticize and forget. The gifted adult, by contrast, remains pure, untested potential, and in their private scoring system, pure potential outranks imperfect achievement every single time. This is the cruelest mechanism inside the asymmetric standard. It allows a person to be quietly losing at life while feeling, almost continuously, as though they are winning. The colleague's book was forgettable, so the gifted adult is still going to write the great one, eventually, when the conditions are finally right, when the inspiration finally arrives. The conditions never arrive. Inspiration was never the actual bottleneck. The bottleneck was always the willingness to be ordinary in public for as long as it takes to eventually become extraordinary. And the gifted adult, more than almost anyone else, refuses to be ordinary where others can see it. So they end up with nothing built. But the nothing arrives beautifully justified, wrapped in the most sophisticated explanations a sharp mind is capable of producing. The asynchronous mind. Here is something most researchers of intelligence rarely say plainly in public. A high IQ does not mean the entire brain is operating at a high level. It means one specific cluster of cognitive functions, pattern recognition, working memory, verbal reasoning, the abilities standardized tests are built to measure, is operating at a high level. The system responsible for turning what the brain already knows into what the hands actually do is called executive function, and it lives largely in a different part of the brain entirely, the prefrontal cortex. In a great many gifted individuals, that system is not simply average. It is measurably underdeveloped relative to their raw cognitive horsepower. The clinical psychologist Peg Dawson, who has worked with gifted adults for more than 30 years, describes a pattern she calls asynchronous development. The cognitive engine matures years ahead of the operator behind the wheel. The analytical mind may reach near adult sophistication by roughly age 12, while the capacity to organize, plan, initiate tasks, sustain attention, manage emotion, and actually follow through can remain closer to that of a 14-year-old for years afterward. This is not simply a metaphor. Researchers using functional MRI to study cognitively advanced children during the 2010s repeatedly found delayed maturation in the prefrontal regions responsible for self-regulation and long-term goal pursuit. The cognitive horsepower shows up first. The driver, quite literally, shows up late, and sometimes never fully shows up at all. This asynchrony is closely related to a separate, well-documented finding in psychology. Across large-scale studies, conscientiousness, the personality trait linked to organization, follow-through, and self-discipline, has repeatedly proven to be at least as strong a predictor of career success and life satisfaction as raw cognitive ability. and in many long-term studies, a stronger one. Intelligence can identify the target. It is conscientiousness, largely governed by that same slow-maturing executive system that actually walks the distance to reach it. There is an even older piece of evidence pointing the same direction. In the 1960s and 70s, the psychologist Walter Mischel ran what became known as the marshmallow experiment at Stanford, offering young children a single treat now or 2 treats later if they could simply wait. The children's ability to delay gratification in that small room turned out to predict, years later, meaningful differences in their academic performance, health, and general life outcomes. Not because the children who waited were smarter, but because their capacity for self-regulation was stronger. Intelligence and self-regulation are not the same faculty, and they do not automatically travel together. This explains something that otherwise looks like a contradiction. A brilliant adult can hold something close to a doctoral-level grasp of personal finance and still fail to pay an electricity bill on time. It is not hypocrisy, it is neurology. The part of the brain that understands the bill is simply not functionally connected, at the level that matters, to the part of the brain responsible for paying it. The gifted child usually learns very early that they can compensate for this gap. School, for them, is a low-execution environment. Deadlines are forgiving, demands are spread thin, and raw cognitive speed can rescue almost any crisis the night before it's due. So the slower, more tedious systems that other students are forced to build simply to survive are never built at all. Then the gifted child grows into an adult, enters a world where execution is everything and cognition alone is a commodity, and the whole unbuilt structure quietly collapses under its own weight. This should reframe everything discussed so far. The brilliant person whose life adds up to so little is rarely guilty of arrogance or laziness or even fear in the ordinary sense of the word. In most cases, they are contending with a specific neurological imbalance that their environment never forced them to correct, because their cognitive gifts kept concealing the deficit at every point where it might otherwise have been caught. By the time the gap becomes visible to them, it is decades old, deeply automated, and stitched into nearly every habit they own. They cannot think their way out of it, because thinking is the part of the machine that still works perfectly. The broken part is the part responsible for turning thought into motion. And here is the detail almost no self-help book will admit. Thinking harder about the problem actually makes the imbalance worse. The more a gifted person analyzes their own stagnation, the more resources get pulled toward the cognitive system that is already overdeveloped, leaving even less available to fund the executive system that desperately needs it. They are, quite literally, feeding the wrong half of the machine. This is the point in a gifted adult's life where most of them quietly break. Most never fully recover. They learn instead to live inside the gap, using their considerable intelligence to construct increasingly elegant explanations for exactly why their life looks the way it does. The explanations are sophisticated, the lives remain small. The contempt reflex. There is a particular expression that crosses an intelligent person's face when someone describes an ordinary path to success. The years of unglamorous networking, the relentless saying yes to things beneath them, the slow accumulation of relationships, reputation, and small, dull wins. Watch closely and something flickers there for a fraction of a second. A quiet dismissal, a thought that will never quite reach the surface in words. That's not real success. That's just persistence. Anyone could grind their way to that. Real success is what I would build, if I ever bothered. This is the contempt reflex, and it functions as the final lock on the door. The gifted adult has internalized, usually without ever examining it, the belief that intelligence is supposed to be a shortcut, that cleverness should be able to bypass the slow, unglamorous labor that ordinary people are apparently forced to endure. Networking, in this worldview, is for people who lack ideas of their own. Marketing is for people without real substance behind their work. Showing up consistently is for people who need external structure because they lack inspiration. Self-promotion is undignified. Asking for help is a small defeat. Doing what everyone else is already doing is, by definition, unoriginal. So they refuse to do any of it, not because they are incapable, but because doing it would mean confessing that intelligence was never the magic key they were promised as children, and that even they, gifts and all, would have to put in the same tedious repetitions as everyone else. The organizational psychologist Adam Grant, in his research on hidden potential, notes that the highest performers in almost any field are rarely the most naturally talented people in the room. They are, overwhelmingly, the ones most willing to keep doing unglamorous work for unglamorous stretches of time. Elite violinists who still drill basic fundamentals well into their 40s. World-class surgeons who review basic anatomy on quiet weekends. Novelists who spend 2 full years writing material they know is bad, simply to locate their voice underneath it. Talent without that particular willingness is, in Grant's framing, just unspent currency sitting idle. Watching this kind of unglamorous discipline in someone else produces, in the gifted adult, a familiar discomfort. Doing the same work themselves would mean being visibly mediocre for a while, being a beginner, in public, at 40 or 50, in front of people who already assume they should be past that stage. It would mean surrendering the one belief their entire identity has quietly been built around, the assumption that they were always past beginning. They would rather have nothing at all, and, in time, that is exactly what most of them end up with. The contempt reflex almost never announces itself honestly. It dresses itself up instead as standards, as taste, as discernment. I'm simply not going to network in that transactional way. I refuse to chase trends. I won't lower myself to that kind of self-promotion. Stripped of its costume, the sentence underneath is far simpler and far more uncomfortable. I cannot tolerate being seen as a beginner by strangers. The translation is blunt, but it is accurate, and the price for refusing to hear it is paid quietly, in every version of a life that never got built, because the contempt reflex talked its owner out of every available entry point. 5 hiding places, 1 life. Step back from all 5 traps for a moment and look at them together. The recognition sedative, which lets a person feel they've already done something simply by understanding it. The praise paradox, which trades a real life for a protected identity. The asymmetric standard, which refuses the entire middle ground where ordinary human lives are actually assembled. The asynchronous mind, which builds a powerful engine with no working driver behind it. The contempt reflex, which refuses every unglamorous repetition that might eventually compound into something real. None of these 5 is, at its root, a problem of intelligence. Every one of them is a problem of self-deception. The gifted adult is not failing because the world declines to recognize them. In most measurable ways, the world is statistically slightly more inclined to recognize a gifted person than an average one. Recognition was never the actual bottleneck. Execution was. And every one of the 5 traps exists, functionally, to protect the person from the exact moment their intelligence would stop being a private, comfortable possession and become something public, measurable, and falsifiable. Each trap is, in the end, simply a hiding place. The recognition sedative hides a person from the discomfort of starting. The praise paradox hides them from the possibility of ever truly failing. The asymmetric standard hides them from the long tedium of being mediocre on the road to becoming good. The asynchronous mind hides them from the unglamorous labor of building executive systems from scratch. The contempt reflex hides them from the plain indignity of being a visible beginner. 5 hiding places. 1 life, slowly filling up with their absence instead of with anything real. The reckoning. For most of these adults, a particular moment eventually arrives, usually somewhere in the late 30s or early 40s. They look around and notice, often for the first time with real clarity, that people they once quietly dismissed have built things. Actual companies that exist and employ people. Actual books that were finished, published, and sit on real shelves. Reputations that have compounded steadily over 2 decades. Relationships that have weathered real time. The gifted adult, standing in the middle of all this, often has none of it, only a head full of unrealized ideas and a chest full of well-rehearsed explanations. This is the moment most of them finally break. And the break tends to take one of 2 shapes. In the first shape, they collapse the lie. They look at themselves without the usual flattering distortion, accept that they have spent decades being smart instead of being effective, and begin the slow, humbling work of rebuilding from something close to the beginning. They take the entry-level version of tasks they should have started 20 years earlier. They tolerate the humiliation that comes with visibly starting late. They build something, usually far smaller than whatever they once fantasized about, but immeasurably more than the nothing they had before. In the second shape, they protect the lie instead. They grow quietly bitter. They construct increasingly elaborate theories explaining exactly why the world failed to deliver what they were always owed. They become the sharpest voice in every comment section, The friend who can explain with devastating clarity why everyone else's success is somehow fake or undeserved. They die clever, and they die unbuilt. The choice between these two shapes is almost never made at 40. It is made in hundreds of small, comfortable decisions, starting somewhere around the age of 22. Every time a gifted adult reads one more book about a goal instead of acting on it, that is a small vote for the second shape. Every time they avoid attempting something they might turn out to be mediocre at, that is a vote for the second shape. Every time they feel that private flicker of contempt towards someone doing slow, unglamorous work, that is a vote for the second shape. Every time they choose to keep living inside the fantasy of who they could become, rather than becoming someone slightly smaller but genuinely real, that is another vote cast the same way. Each of those votes is small enough to forget by lunchtime, which is exactly why the tally goes unnoticed for so long. Nobody wakes up one morning having decided to waste a mind. It happens the way erosion happens, one comfortable afternoon at a time, until the shoreline is simply gone and there is no single afternoon left to blame for it. What actually erased the promise was never a world too dull to notice him. It was the accumulated preference, chosen quietly and repeatedly, for the warm certainty of feeling capable over the cold risk of finding out. What Terman never saw. Lewis Terman genuinely believed his termites would go on to shape the 20th century. What he never fully grasped, even as the results accumulated year after year, decade after decade, is that his selection method had quietly filtered for the trap itself. The children with extraordinarily high IQ scores were, almost by definition, children whose intelligence had been visible and celebrated from a very young age. Children whose parents and teachers had already begun treating them as special, who had built an identity around being smart, long before they had built any habits around being effective, who had lived inside the recognition sedative for close to a decade before most of them even reached puberty. Terman was not, in the end, studying the brightest minds available to him in California. He was studying the most identity-protected ones. Shockley and Alvarez, rejected from that protection by a narrow margin, were left instead to do the slow, unglamorous work of simply becoming. They argued with colleagues who disagreed with them. They ran experiments that failed, publicly, and had to be redesigned. They worked on problems well beneath their eventual stature, because that is where careers in physics actually begin. They were never shielded from the ordinary indignity of being a beginner. So, in time, they became scientists whose work reshaped their field. The termites were shielded from exactly that indignity from childhood onward, so most of them became dentists. The question underneath. If any part of your life has involved being told sincerely that you have potential, the question worth sitting with tonight is probably not whether that praise was true. It very likely was. The far more uncomfortable question is this. In the years since you first heard it, has that praise been functioning as fuel or as a sedative? If it has been fuel, the evidence will be visible somewhere outside your own head, in something finished, something imperfect, something the world is free to judge, something that exists now and did not exist before. If it has instead been operating as a sedative, you already know that too, somewhere beneath the explanations. You've been staying warm inside the feeling of who you could eventually become, while the years quietly pass and the actual work never quite gets built. So, 3 questions worth turning over slowly rather than answering out loud. First, what is the one thing you already know how to do that you have simply never allowed yourself to be openly mediocre at while learning to do it well? Second, whose slow, unglamorous discipline have you privately dismissed as just persistence because watching it up close was easier than admitting it might be the real difference between you? Third, and hardest of all, if nobody ever discovers your potential, if no one ever arrives to recognize what you always suspected about yourself, what, exactly, are you personally willing to go and build instead? Most people who needed to hear all of this will feel, right about now, a genuine wave of recognition. They will nod along. They will think, yes, this is exactly right, this is exactly me. They will finish watching, feel briefly, quietly different, and then do nothing at all. That, more than any single fact in this entire script, is the detail worth sitting with tonight. Stay for the next one. If this is the kind of thinking you want to keep encountering, the kind that occasionally cuts closer than expected and doesn't let you off the hook quietly, consider staying around. Subscribe, and let's keep asking the uncomfortable questions together, one video at a time. There is more of this ahead, and it tends to find the people who are actually ready for it.